All right. Next, we're going to look at evaluating the increasing public debt, the rising public debt. But first, we need to have a few things defined. So we can talk about two different types of public debt. We have gross public debt and we have net public debt. Now, gross public debt is the government's obligations in terms of what it has to pay back, regardless of who owns it, okay? Now, compare that with net public debt, which is gross public debt minus any debt that is held by government itself. So as it turns out, the government sometimes lends money to itself as far as like other departments go. So the FBI might have some extra money that it lends to the Department of Homeland Security, or the FDA might have some extra money that it loans to, say, the Department of Education. And so if we get rid of sort of that intergovernment borrowing, we have net public debt, okay, which is kind of the more important one to look at, because here this includes the money that government owes to itself, so it kind of balances itself out. So we really are more interested in net public debt. And as we've already mentioned, the government raises money by selling bonds. That's how it borrows money, is through the sales of bonds. Okay, and so like I said, some government bonds are held by other government agencies, so the government borrowing and lending to itself. And so in this case, the funds are owed from one branch of the federal government to another, and so we want to subtract this portion of the public debt from gross public debt to arrive at net public debt. Now, let's think about tax revenues and relate it to economic growth. So when economic growth starts to slow, people make less money, businesses make less money, and so tax revenues during slow economic growth tend to be stagnant, whereas when incomes grow because of the result of growth, economic growth, tax revenues also increase. But as long as spending exceeds revenues, we will nevertheless have budget deficits. Now, during World War II, as I pointed out earlier in that graph, the net public debt grew substantially. And then immediately after the war, the net public debt actually fell a little bit up until the mid-60s and into the 70s. And then it started rising again going into the 80s. We had that period of budget surplus in the late 90s during the Clinton administration when our net public debt declined because of that surplus. But since 9/11, the net public debt has been increasing substantially, and now it's going to increase very, very much. So here's some data on the federal deficit, our public debt, and the interest that we pay on it. So we've got years over here. So for the most part, it goes in increments of 5 years up until 2015, and then we see 2016 and 2017. All right, so here we've got the federal budget deficit in these years. Okay, so in 1940, the government spent $49 billion more than it brought in. Now, do note that this is in terms of constant 2009 dollars, so we can easily compare all of these years. All these years' deficits have been adjusted for inflation. Okay, so 49 billion. That's really nothing these days. But then going into World War II. Huge increase in the deficit, right up to 500 billion, which is $500 billion in 2009 dollars. Then after World War II, it fell substantially. We had nearly a balanced budget in 1960. But since then, it's gone up, except for that period of time in the late 90s, early 2000s, when we had a budget surplus. But then since then, we've had deficits. And again, so if we had 2020 on here, right, 2020 is going to be somewhere in the ballpark of $4.5 trillion. So it would be $4,500 billion. Okay, so that's the deficit, and then compare that with the public debt, right? So here was the debt in 1940. We had several years of high deficits during World War II, and so the public debt grew substantially. We paid some of that debt off going into the 70s, but then as we progressed into the 80s, we started having deficits again, so the debt started going up. And then note here, going from 1995 to 2000, we had that surplus, so we actually paid some of our debt off, so the debt came down. But then since the early 2000s, it's gone up substantially. And in 2007, it was at $13 trillion. So we've increased our debt just this year alone by around a third, right? Maybe even more by the end of the year, depending on how all this goes. One convenient way to look at the public debt is put it in per capita terms. So divide this number by the population, so you get, you can kind of look at, what is each person's fraction of the debt. Okay, so in 1940, for every U.S. citizen, there was basically each U.S. citizen on average owed $4,000 in terms of public debt. That has ballooned up to $40,000 in 2017, and by the end of 2020, just kind of off the top of my head, we're probably looking at $50,000 or $55,000 per person that the government owes. It's a lot of money, right? And this is probably right around maybe a little less than the average American income. Which means if we wanted to pay off our debt, everybody would have to work for an entire year and not get paid. Just put that money straight to paying off debt. That's one way to think about it, right? Can you imagine if everybody in the United States worked and didn't bring any money home? They just paid off debt. Of course, we couldn't do that. We have to eat and pay our bills, so we couldn't possibly do that, but that's what it would take. Okay, and then here we've got interest costs, right? So it costs money to borrow money, right? Interest. What are we paying in interest? Okay, so of course, as our debt goes up, our interest goes up. But here you go, right? In 2017, we were paying around $270 billion just in interest. Now, that sounds like a lot, and it sounds like it might be a problem, but keep in mind that this debt, these interest payments, are being made to a large extent to U.S. citizens, because a large portion of the U.S. debt is owned by U.S. citizens, as well as foreign governments and foreign citizens as well. But some of this interest is being paid as interest payments to U.S. citizens, so keep that in mind. And then here's interest as a percentage of GDP. So not too bad, but a substantial portion of GDP is going just to paying interest on the government's debt. And then here it is in a graph. So public debt as a percentage of GDP over time, really high, over 100% right at the peak of World War II, came down substantially, and it's peaked recently now. This is going to jump up, probably not. Well, yeah, actually probably is going to get right around 100% or more. So we're going to see levels of public debt as a percentage of GDP that we haven't seen since World War II. Now, of course, the government has to pay interest on this debt, right, like we've been talking about. And the amount that it has to pay depends on the market interest rate. And interest payments as a percentage of GDP are likely to rise in the future. Now, I will point out that this point here is actually going to help us out. So, yeah, the government's basically borrowing somewhere around $4 trillion just in the past couple months. The good news is that interest rates are really, really low right now because of the actions that the Fed are taking, which we're going to learn about in the next chapter. But the good news is that it's able to borrow that money pretty cheaply. Now, we're going to talk about this in the next chapter, but nothing comes without trade-offs. So while it is able to borrow that money pretty cheaply, we're probably going to see some pretty high inflation in the next 5 to 10 years as a result of what the Fed is doing. But we're going to talk about that in the next chapter. Now, I mentioned this point looking at the table. As more of the public debt is held by foreigners, more of this interest is being paid to people outside of the United States. So that's maybe a cause for concern. And in fact, foreign residents, businesses, and governments hold the majority of our public debt. So not ideal. We don't owe the debt just to ourselves. As U.S. citizens, we do owe a substantial portion of the debt to other countries and other foreigners. Now, if the economy is at full employment, right, we're in the long run equilibrium, recall that further provision of government goods, government expenditures can crowd out some private expenditure. And so deficit spending may also raise interest rates. Recall that as well. That's the reason for crowding out, which will in turn discourage capital formation, investment in the private sector. So that's another issue that we have here with public deficits and debt, is that it can cause crowding out. That crowding out issue we saw in the last chapter. And of course, this crowding out can place a burden on future generations. It leads to increased present consumption as a result of the increased expenditures, but it's of course crowding out investment. And if we're not investing in the economy, then we're gonna have economic growth is going to be hurt by that, right? Which of course, if economic growth is hurt, that means that future generations are poorer. They have less wealth. And so on top of that, taxes may have to be increased in the future, right? So we're going to have to pay this money back somehow. One way to pay it back is to increase taxes, okay? So that's another way that this increase in debt can hurt future generations, is by increasing the debt in the future. The other way is, other than paying it in taxes, another way is to devalue our currency. That's a monetary policy issue, but that still hurts future generations in the form of higher prices, inflation, and we'll see that in the next chapter. All right, so in terms of paying off the public debt in the future, if the debt becomes larger, each person's share, right, per capita debt increases, and so taxes would have to be levied. And then, of course, we also have to think about the fact that taxes aren't necessarily levied or assessed equally. In most cases, rich people pay higher taxes, although that's kind of not entirely true. If you want to ask me about that, send me an email and I'll talk about that more. But I don't want to get too political right now. In terms of ability to pay, it could be that a special tax could be levied in terms of ability to pay, which is kind of what we have with a progressive tax system. But a lot of rich people pay less taxes because they don't earn their money from income, they earn their money from investments. So issues for another class, perhaps. What about our debt to foreign residents, right? Again, we don't owe all of the debt to ourselves. The majority of the debt is owned by foreign residents or governments. And so what this means is that U.S. residents in the future are going to have to be taxed to pay those people back, those foreigners and foreign governors back, in terms of the principal, which is the borrowed money, as well as the interest payments. And so basically what that means is that portions of U.S. incomes are going to be transferred overseas. All right, so thinking about this, let's look at an international example. What nation's residents have the largest holdings of U.S. public debt? So the current amount of U.S. net debt outstanding is around 15 trillion, but again, this is basically going to jump to around 20 trillion after this year. And out of that debt, Japan and China each hold about roughly 10% of it at $1.4 trillion. And this basically means that close to 1/5 of the U.S. net public debt comes from public residing in these two Asian nations. 1/5? That'd be 20%. I think that's a typo. It should be 1/10, roughly 1/10.